The views in this podcast are those of the contributors and don't necessarily represent those of CISL, the University of Cambridge or Investec, and should not be taken as advice or a recommendation. Welcome to What Next? Leadership Conversations for a Better Future from the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership in partnership with Investec. This series is hosted by Lindsay Hooper and Marc Kahn.
Hello and welcome to What Next? Leadership Conversations for a Better Future, where we explore how leaders can help build future-fit economies. I'm Lindsay Hooper, Chief Executive at the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership.
And I'm Marc Kahn, Chief Strategy and Sustainability Officer at Investec. Together, we'll bring fresh perspectives, provocative questions, and conversations with leaders who are shaping the future of markets, business, and society.
Welcome to this episode. Today we're looking at how philanthropy can catalyse a shift to more sustainable economies and societies. And we're starting from a simple premise that new economic ideas are needed, as is innovation, to build cleaner, greener, fairer economies of the future. And today, philanthropy funds a really important share of that ideas generation, whether that's in policy, tech innovation, or new business models. Ideas that are very focused on catalysing change so economies do deliver for people, for nature, and for climate. And when it comes to philanthropy to tackle systemic issues, we want to understand and to explore what works and what doesn't, what leadership's needed now, not only from funders, but from those they collaborate with and those they fund. Our guests today bring two valuable and distinct vantage points. Peter Bennett built a career in banking and hedge funds before focusing on philanthropy, and for more than a decade, his foundation supported health, education and welfare across Southeast Asia. But more recently, he's been funding institutions with the express focus on driving system change. And much of his focus and investment has been on universities, including institutes in Cambridge, Oxford and Sussex, focused on policy, innovation and applied data. We're also joined by Leslie Johnston, who's got 25 years of management experience across entrepreneurship, development and philanthropy. As Laudes Foundation's founding CEO, Leslie leads its work via its 300 plus partners on its mission to accelerate the transition to a green, fair and inclusive global economy. Delighted to welcome you both today.
It's great to have two individuals at the forefront of philanthropy in the conversation. But just as a way of entry into your own personal story, could you each give us a sense of why philanthropy is important to you?
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. So why philanthropy? To be honest, I didn't even know philanthropy was a thing in terms of an industry and a job opportunity. I'd been happily working along both in business, and then I spent 10 years living and working in Africa, really trying to help build viable businesses that could create jobs and opportunity. I was almost serendipitously picked up by a headhunter to come and run a foundation that was funding the work that I was doing in Africa. And that's where I discovered the power of philanthropy, because I think having such a flexible, nimble, not unlimited, but quite generous source of finance that can actually help you test things, try things, see what works and fail has been phenomenal when it comes to trying to figure out how to solve our poly crisis. So I'm a big champion and I'm very excited about the power of philanthropy, but it is an industry and it's a very small industry. It's less than $1 trillion that maybe many people don't even know exists.
Leslie, thank you. Peter, over to you.
I think my journey probably started after I was fortunate enough to create a level of wealth that I realized after 2, 3, 4 years I would not be able to spend on myself or my family. And at that stage, you have to start to think, well, if it's not going to be spent, what's going to happen to the money? And of course, leaving some of it or all of it to family and children might be one solution. But I felt that perhaps giving a bit of it away would make sense. So set up a foundation about 13 years ago. And then there was a journey of starting initially with some of the bigger household names in philanthropy and giving them grants and seeing how they spent that, mainly in Southeast Asia. That ticked some boxes, but not others. I moved on from that to starting to fund smaller charities. And that was really interesting and heartwarming. But I also realized that it's hard to scale those small charities. And then about 8 years ago, I happened to talk to Cambridge and thought maybe we should give some money here, and started with a chair, which became an institute, which became a school, because it just seemed to tick the boxes. And so I've pivoted more in the recent years towards giving money to larger institutions such as UK universities.
Thank you, Peter. What we want to tackle is what I would refer to as the big question about philanthropy, and that is philanthropy worth it? Does philanthropy make for a better world? So that's the first question. And the second part of that is to say, when philanthropy does make a difference, what is involved in that compared to the kind of armchair charity that goes into an endless set of dependencies? What is the difference between those two forms of philanthropy? So could we refer to it as sustainable philanthropy versus dependency-based philanthropy? So that's the big opening question that we want to get to the heart of. How does philanthropy really make a difference? And at a large scale, is philanthropy important to the world in making a difference to some of the very challenging vectors we see in inequality and planet-based boundaries that are being exceeded?
That is indeed a big question. So the question around, is philanthropy worth it, or is it making a difference? I mean, ultimately, you'd want to look at the value of philanthropy versus the opportunity cost of having philanthropy, because if philanthropy didn't exist, then that money would sit with business or government. So there is a question that I would have as to whether or not philanthropy is able to play a very different and a catalytic role that business or government under our current construct cannot play. And I think the answer to that is yes, indeed it can. But I think what's most important is to say that philanthropy, at least the type of philanthropy that we do, strategic philanthropy, works best when it makes the market mechanism work its best. And that's getting to your second question. But ultimately, the market is an effective change agent, but it's imperfect. It's actually perfect in that supply equals demand, but it's imperfect in that it doesn't have guardrails that actually enable people, planet, nature to fully benefit from what could happen through a market mechanism, through business, for example. And that's where I think philanthropy can come in a way that, say, business or government can't. It can help to craft incentives for businesses to start to value climate and nature and people along with profit. It can actually create the incentives for the ingenuity and the innovation that you need to see to actually change the systems. It can lift up the voices of those who are not at the table and actually make sure they're part of the solution. There's a great example of that we do at Laudes, which is community land trusts, where we're actually trying to get tenants and communities to actually have teeth in the game when it comes to solutions around buildings and climate. Or it can even help to influence some of the rules of the system. So it can do things that these entities can't do on their own, but it inevitably, to be effective, needs to be catalytic. Philanthropy isn't there to scale things. It's there to actually spark something new, catalyze momentum, and then let the power of business, government, civil society to take on a change and bring it to scale. And there's lots of examples of how philanthropy has been effective in history, as well as even current examples that we touch. And to your second question, philanthropy is most effective when it can actually catalyze that market mechanism. And sometimes that means taking a risk. Something that we did a few years ago was set up a platform to help fashion companies essentially share what they're doing in innovation and link to innovators to help them change the way that they run their supply chains. So to bring more sustainability to supply chains. That's Fashion for Good. And Fashion for Good as a platform would never have popped up. I mean, no one brand would have created it to help all the brands in the industry get better and embrace sustainability. But Philanthropy was able to take that big bet, put significant money down, but create that space that connects 12% of the fashion industry with innovators, with capital, with the supply chain to show what better business and more sustainable practices can look like. So I think it can work, but it also works when it can actually activate that market mechanism.
What you're saying is philanthropy works and is worth it when it catalyzes a market mechanism, which I'm making the assumption would then result in a sustainable set of activities that propel themselves within the market on an ongoing basis and no longer are dependent on free capital. So it triggers what would not necessarily occur, and then in the long game, the market is better for it and people and planet as a result. Does that mean, Leslie, and in your opinion, that charity to the poor in a kind of pure charitable sense is not the best form of philanthropy? Or do you think that that should also happen but is something different?
Yeah, we absolutely need that. And what I'm saying by preferring this type of strategic philanthropy doesn't negate the need for the more charitable philanthropy. People are suffering, actually today more than ever. So we do need that. What the difference is, the type of strategic philanthropy is also looking at how do we tackle the root cause of the issue that is causing the suffering in the first place.
Thank you, Leslie. Peter, over to you on the grand question.
I think that I realized over time in my business career, finance career, that what seemed to work best was finding good people with doing good things in a institution that could create a very profitable, sizable business. So when I ended my business career, that probably left its mark on me about how you might want to give away money. Find really smart people doing good things for institutions or building their own institutions that could make a difference. Trying to find institutions that I think will not disappear when the charismatic individual running them passes away or passes it on to their children who don't have the same charisma. It's safer to find institutions that could perhaps take good ideas and make them last for decades and then centuries. So I like that idea. Academic institutions can do that. I'm not sure there's anything else I would do other than talking to lots of different people, 100 different people a year. Just finding really smart people with good ideas who, as you quiz them and drive down into what they're hoping to do, just seem to make sense and have the range of skills to be successful, whether it's in the old days in a for-profit business or now on the philanthropic side in an area where they're trying to affect change which doesn't necessarily make money.
I want to come to some of the practical examples, and you talk very compellingly about finding smart people and backing them, but the domains in which you've found the people and invested them have been in places where it's around innovation and policy and new economic ideas. But I'm interested in, are there real world examples where you've seen that through investing in people, you've seen things change in the real world? And Leslie, I'd love to come back to your offer earlier to bring some examples to the table about where has work been catalytic. But I'm just interested in examples of how the kinds of approach that you support actually has led to shifts within society.
Public policy was an area where I felt that if only we could have better public policy, wouldn't it be great to allow institutions who could research, explain, and persuade others to introduce public policy that I felt might be, from my perspective, more efficient and ideally more inclusive. So that was Cambridge. And that has gone on through various evolutions now into a school where we go from ideas into teaching students one day, and further research and increasing knowledge of perhaps better ways of delivering public policy. Another example I'll give is Oxford, where I met a very charismatic individual who wanted to use data to improve the way we deliver healthcare, but was also very open to using it to improve the way we deliver education and other areas. So that was, again, relatively easy working for a well-known university. The Science Museum were looking at funding for new labs, and I said, there's nothing here that I'd fund except for the Wonder Lab, which is for kids, because everything else that you do looks backward, and I want to look forwards. So there I met an individual who said, no, actually, we want to do that too. So we agreed, let's do a Tomorrow Lab that will look at the challenges that science should be thinking about looking forward. But it's finding the right institution. Science Museum within the UK, Science Museum's a logical place. But you have to meet charismatic individuals who like the idea that either they propose or you propose, and they quickly latch on. And I think the things that I've done have tended to be really just conversations with smart people about whether we've got a meeting of minds of what might change the world.
So I wanted to respond to your challenge as to an example of where this has been effective and where philanthropy has been effective. And I want to take a card from Larry Kramer, who used to run the Hewlett Foundation, because he's always told this story, and I think it's very compelling, is that the neoliberal capitalism that we all know and defines how we operate and how our businesses are successful really started as a gathering of people at the base of Mount Pelerin in Switzerland with a very compelling vision that was slowly backed by philanthropists. And the role of quiet philanthropy over the years to back this way of thinking, in combination with academic institutions like the University of Chicago, was involved. And focusing on ideas is what made this so powerful. And I think it's important to point this out as an example, because what we know to be the way of operating, and of course we know there's challenges with neoliberal capitalism, which we're trying to address with climate and nature breakdown, and how can you make business see value in addressing those things. This started as a very decentralized thing. And I think where these philanthropists, these early philanthropists were very successful is they didn't try to centralize. They didn't have KPIs. They didn't actually require annual reporting that outlines all the activities you did. They slowly found those with the ideas, maybe to what you're just saying, back them quietly and help link those ideas to policymakers who could put those ideas into policies and rules, and link those ideas to the public through a narrative that could bring broad support for it. So it's a very interesting story of how over decades philanthropy can be very effective. Now, if I fast forward to now, there's a lot of philanthropy, for example, climate philanthropy, that's really trying to tackle the climate crisis using those same tools. We use those same tools. We use narrative to try to show the positive solutions around climate action, or we use rules of the game to work through, say, coalitions of C40 to try to inspire mayors of cities around the world what could be possible if they put certain incentives in place for the areas they govern. There's all these tools that I think are really important. And where I think maybe we've been most and least successful has been on the policy side, because I think we've had a tremendous moment in the world where there's been a surge of sustainability policies, CS triple, CSRD, et cetera, and now we're seeing the pushback on that, which makes me realize, and I think this echoes what you've already said, is that the rules are really important and we need to support them and we need them to lift the laggards, but they're not sufficient in themselves. We need these other elements that can bring other folks along. And that's why initiatives like I mentioned, Fashion for Good, are really successful, because innovation is fun and sexy and people want to be part of it and they want to invest in it and they want it in their supply chain. And I think there's a lot around kind of the creativity and ingenuity of business that philanthropy can help lift and hopefully bring others along.
A very big systemic historical perspective on philanthropy, which I don't think many people who listen to the podcast would have ever registered philanthropy in that vein. This is a very powerful idea. The conversation for a better future is had when you have powerful leaders who collaborate with the benefit of capital in a giving way and look at the problems of the world and say we can change it?
In the early days of Laudes Foundation, and we were only 5 years old, our original theory of change was very simple, which was we're trying to change the mindsets, rules, and power dynamics in our system to help us better address what we said at the time was this dual crisis of climate and inequality. Now we know it's more than climate and inequality. It's nature, it's cost of living crises, it's lots of crises, geopolitical tensions that we're discovering. But ultimately, philanthropy should try to change those deeply rooted kind of root causes of these problems. And mindsets is one, power dynamics. Those who have the least power in the world, think of a garment worker in Bangladesh. They have no power, hardly, yet they have probably the most to lose when it comes to rising waters because of climate change. And innovation, narratives, all of these elements are critical for doing that, and philanthropy can play a role. So you're right. I think that to change a system, this is a story of systems change in which philanthropy has a role. But everyone else has a role too. Business, government, investors, workers. We're all on deck.
I think that I completely agree with those comments. It's only a part of the solution, the capital that is put into and the individuals who are working in the philanthropic sector. And within the not-for-profit sector, there are places like universities that can do things that perhaps would not be done in the private sector or even by other types of charities. So they're a little less selfish about sharing ideas than maybe the corporate world. I found that in funding 3, 4, 5 of these, now they can all talk to each other and see that, oh, you're doing something very different than we do as economists. Oh, you're doing something very different in health than we do as engineers. That having an innovation lab, which is run by an engineer, talking to a public policy lab run by an economist, talking to a applied data science lab, which focused on medical health, run by a doctor and an epidemiologist. When they get in a room together, which I try to do, as I used to at JP Morgan or in the hedge fund world, you just put smart people together and say, okay, what's this hedge fund doing that's so different than the other 10 hedge funds that got Sharpe ratios of over 3? And we just thrash out, what is it that really gives them their edge? And you kind of need to know about a lot of different ways of making money in finance to be able to identify those that have not just 2 or 3 ways, but have 5 or 7 ways, which gives them a higher Sharpe ratio. So I can go back to finance. But a lot of what I've done is really just drawing on what I learned from the finance world, that you put people who have a different knowledge base together, and if they respect each other, they will share. And so many new things are starting to come out as these individuals talk about focusing on their particular problem using the skills and models of others who don't come from an engineering, medical, or economics background.
Thank you. I'm really keen to dig deeper into your respective insight into really what works and also lessons along the way about what doesn't work, perhaps. And you've talked really compellingly there about, I suppose, diversity of discipline and getting smart people in a room. I'm also interested in philanthropists alongside other players in society, back to that point about engaging and influencing with policy or catalysing changing markets. The way that you framed it, Marc, around philanthropy being free to think longer term, big picture, blue sky, not having the same constraints that listed businesses have. I'm interested in what trends you see, if any, in philanthropy and the bubble that I sit in, a lot in the interface between the private sector, finance and government, a lot of interesting work being funded by philanthropy. I'm seeing on the one hand, the there's been such a backlash and it's been so politicized that strategic philanthropy are almost the last one standing, funding the most interesting work in some places. But on the other hand, I'm seeing a shift towards, I suppose, fatalism, a kind of lack of confidence that actually we will make progress. I think to the point you're alluding to, Leslie, like the real world that we're in, this sense of, well, we have to focus on resilience and we have to focus on adaptation because we're not seeing the cut-throughs at the pace we need. So those are two different stories that I see. One is philanthropy is absolutely there and being catalytic and more strategic. And on the other hand, being more realistic and saying, look, we just have to focus on resilience because that's where the world's at. This is only $1 trillion of funding. What can we do? So I'm interested in whether you see any trends within the philanthropy domain at the moment, given the state we're in.
Focusing on adaptation or resilience doesn't mean we're giving up. It just means we realize that the climate crisis is real and we are there to support. And there's still opportunity for market mechanisms in there. So I guess maybe taking a step back, I see a couple trends over the past couple of years, and some are good and some are bad. Because I think the good ones are in philanthropy. First of all, you're seeing the rise of big players, especially in the climate space. And that's a great thing because we need more money. As we both said, it's just under $1 trillion, and only about 2% goes to climate mitigation. So it's very, very small what's going into climate philanthropy. So we are seeing bigger players come on. The other good thing is we're seeing a lot more collaboration and real collaboration. I know that we as funders always try to get our partners to collaborate, which no one really likes, but they do it as part of the funding. But I think as funders, the collaboration across funders has not historically been great. And I think it's improving. And I think there's some really compelling examples of how we come together and bring the best of what we bring to the table to create something better than all of us. So that's happening. Philanthropy is playing around the edges to try to address maybe the unfortunate things that may happen around inequality, et cetera, but not really looking at how do you accelerate business's journey? And everything from, say, the industry hub that you see popping up with ClimateWorks Foundation to the work that we're doing, the work that more corporate foundations are doing, that's super exciting because I think we all know that we need to lift up and accelerate this journey by business and industry. I think what also is happening at the same time is there's more scrutiny on philanthropy. And that may, as you say, lead to some funders maybe pulling back and being a bit quieter. Philanthropy is probably one of the last, I wouldn't say unregulated because it is regulated, but actually there's probably little controls on philanthropy that you see in other sources of, say, finance. And that actually can lead to perceptions of outsized power. That could also lead to some organizations playing in spaces that maybe they shouldn't be playing in. So I do think that there is more scrutiny on that. And that's not a bad thing necessarily, but it does mean that funders need to act differently. I think that we're picking up different tools as well. So grants, of course, is the currency of foundations. But I think the rise of venture philanthropy, which is not a new concept, it's been around for decades, but is actually gaining traction, as well as other ways of investing, is getting quite exciting, I think. Even we at Laudes do mostly grants, but we've also made investments where investments make sense. And we see that more and more in the space.
Peter, are there any trends that you see in the space that you're in?
I think that permanent capital is really valuable to anybody. Providing piecemeal support to charities or educational institutions leads to outcomes that are not nearly as good as if instead of giving people £400,000 a year, you can give them £10 million. And if they're set up to manage the money so they can generate, let's say, inflation plus 4 type returns, which well-run endowments should do, that's a more powerful way to achieve long-term change. So it goes against the grain of a lot of historical philanthropy. It has tended to be smaller grants, do this project, do that project, we'll see how that goes and we'll build. But most people receiving capital would rather have equity capital rather than debt with conditions that could be withdrawn, or rather than annual grants, which changes funders. So just permanent capital for supporting the ideas you like. A small number of ideas rather than 20 different charities, maybe 6 or 8 rather than 20 or 30.
Yeah.
Okay.
You're talking about the backing people, getting disciplines together, about the way in which you're funding fewer things and funding them well so they set up to succeed. I'm interested in any other insights from your journey in philanthropy about what works and what doesn't.
When people said, well, why are you doing this? I've said, I do it for these reasons, and I'm very instinctive. I didn't start with a model for giving. I supported some of the biggest charities. I supported tiny charities that were spending £25,000 a year. And I've ended up most recently in the last few years giving money to academic institutions, mainly in England. That was my journey. I just think everybody's going to have their own journey, starting with how they came to where they are.
I think when I reflect back on what works, and I guess the caveat being that we're still a new kid on the block with just about 5 years under our belt, first, starting with the end in mind, because I think as a relatively smaller foundation, I say smaller vis-a-vis the big climate giants, because we give away 65 million a year, we have to be really careful on where we choose to play and make sure we can be catalytic in doing that. So to do that, we need to be clear of what our winning ambition is. And we spend a lot of time up front thinking about where we're going to play and how we're going to be successful. And it's not everywhere, and it's very focused on specific industries and specific areas within those industries and specific levers that we pull. So there is a strategic shift there that I think is important, because it's very easy to get a little bit distracted and then you end up spraying and praying. So be very focused. And I think also find great partners. I mean, that sounds really obvious, but we're not the ones making the change. We're not at the front lines. It's the partners. And not only finding great partners, but supporting them so that they can not only do great things with your support, but also be stronger as a result. So non-financial support to partners has been really important. We have an internal goal of how much of our grants should go out as general operating support. We have a lot of tools that help our partners strengthen their financials, help with their fundraising, help with marketing, or whatever it is, so that they're stronger as a result of our partnership. So that's really important. And I think the final thing is that ultimately, as philanthropy, we are one of many players that are trying to create this change. So forget about attribution, focus on contribution. And if you focus on contribution, then your end game or your outcomes you're going for need to be systemic outcomes, and you need to be really clear on what it is and a clear way to measure it. So we've come up with a way to try to measure where we're seeing those shifts in the system. It's not perfect, but it's actually quite compelling to help us understand how much we, along with many others, have contributed to, say, the shifts in business behavior or the way investment money is flowing.
I love that framing around less focus on attribution and more on contribution. And that really neatly sums up what I think is needed in the domain we're in, that it matters more that the change happens than that we're strongly positioned as having led it. Just how do we lean in and address the fragmentation and so on?
We're also asking about the kind of leadership mindsets that we need for a better future. Now, from where you sit, both of you, given the interesting perspective that you have through the philanthropy lens, when you look more broadly at the world today and the challenges we're facing, what is the leadership that you so wish we had more of? And what kind of advice would you give leaders, if you had any, at this point?
I'm not sure that I can affect the economic drivers of industry and the way politics plays out. It would be great if I could, but I really don't think I can. So I back leaders who are going to try and change the world in their own way, not my way, but in their own way. And they'll run into problems at universities, in broader society, with the Department of Health or with the ministers of government, whatever. They'll run into those challenges, but you back individuals who are leaders who will manage that process because they have to try and affect what they're trying to do in their particular space. And we can't control everything. All we can do is pick good people and hope they pick good people. That's probably my version of how I want to give away money and how I want my children and foundation to give away money in the future, but they'll make their own decisions.
Peter, the way you've described what you back people, and it sounds as though you recognize all the challenges that they'll have to face. And it doesn't sound as though you're particularly focused on metrics, or you want outcomes, but you hope that you'll get the outcomes by backing people, and that you just trust them, back them to deliver the outcomes.
People and institutions.
People and institutions.
If you're in the academic area, you need to be at the right institutions where this will have the ability to influence discussions in their particular space, and to do that, hopefully, for decades and centuries. And that allows me, in my kind of finance brain mind, I'm just present valuing the difference their work can make, not over 5 years or 10 years, but for centuries. So there is some value that comes from the work that you're funding today. And particularly, we tend to fund with an endowment model where here's a chunk of money, invest it, generate income from that, say 4% per annum, to fund your core needs, generate other funds to fund your other research. But you know that you and the institution you're part of will still be here in 5, 10, 20, 50 years' time. So you make the right long-term decisions.
And then, Leslie, you're clearly a leader in the strategic philanthropy space, a space that has a lot of incredibly smart, thoughtful, systemic thinkers who have the benefit of scanning the landscape, knowing what works, and are often quite structured. As you say, you can't just spray and pray, that you are quite intentional. I know that from those in our domain, in the sustainable business space that rely on philanthropic funding, I know they appreciate the support, and there's a lot of pain associated with all of the reporting. I'm sure they would love someone to have a Peter equivalent who would come and say, just have a huge chunk of core funding. But I'm interested in your views in this space about on that spectrum of just trust people and give them some money to get on with it within supportive institutions versus really structured, measured approaches that are very focused on specific outcomes and deliverables.
We do have a point of view, and we do have a vision for what we would like to see in the various industries in which we're operating. But I would say we've softened a bit in terms of the requirements. I think back to a story when I used to run a different foundation, CNA Foundation, and there we had many metrics, many KPIs, and beautiful dashboards that I placed all over my office walls. I love them. I'm a big data nerd, and they're beautiful, but they didn't tell us anything about how the fashion industry had transformed. They told us how many farmers we touched. They told us the increase in their incomes. They told us everything that was tied to our specific interventions. But as fashion changed, well, actually changed for the worse, and it's continuing to change for the worse. So we're lacking something that was helping us understand how can our relatively minuscule intervention in this massive industry have any contribution toward that industry's change, and has it changed? So that's why I say we're in a little bit a softer version of that metrics-driven strategic philanthropist that you outline, because we're not asking for those same KPIs, but we are baselining. We want to know where the system is now, and we are coming up with rubrics that help us understand the direction of travel. It's very helpful because a rubric can help you understand to what extent do businesses embrace climate positive practices, or to what extent are investors including inequality in their evaluations, their portfolios, for example. So that will help us understand where the system is moving. It won't tell us what we actually did to do that, because again, we're not in the attribution space, but it will tell us what the ultimate impact is. It's really important that leadership takes a multi-generational view. And that sounds kind of obvious, especially if you're coming from a multi-generational family foundation, but it isn't always the case. And it's certainly not the case with business, which has quarterly reporting requirements. And I think what's really important is if you don't take that, then you're probably not going to value the things that should be valued. And I really do think that we should be thinking about, yes, the 8+ billion people in today's world, but also about the 6.7 trillion unborn, because decisions that we make today are going to impact people tomorrow. So that is probably the most important thing. And I think that's probably the thing that's most at risk right now with a lot of the backlash that we see against ESG and sustainability. But I do hope that people keep that in their hearts.
Thank you, Peter and Leslie, for joining us. It's really clear that philanthropy done well is about backing the ideas, the people, and the institutions that can shift systems over decades, and about accepting that contribution matters more than attribution. Peter reminded us that lasting impact depends on finding exceptional people within resilient institutions, and importantly, bringing together diverse disciplines to spark the kind of innovation and systems thinking that drives real change. And as Leslie made clear, philanthropy is most powerful when it catalyses markets, helping business, policy, society align around new rules, new incentives, new mindsets that make better outcomes possible. And both highlighted that leadership in philanthropy means thinking in terms of generations, not just the next quarter. It means being a good ancestor, investing in ideas that will outlive us, and trusting others to carry them forward. You've been listening to What Next? Leadership Conversations for a Better Future.
This show is presented by Lindsay Hooper, Chief Executive of CISL, and Marc Kahn, Investec's Chief Strategy and Sustainability Officer. The producers are Carl Homer of Cambridge TV and Alexa Selwood. The executive producer is Gillian Secret, and it's produced in partnership with Investec. Thank you for listening. For more episodes, subscribe on any major podcast platform or visit the Leadership Hub on the CISL website or Investec Focus. You'll find the address in the show notes.